Welcome back to Nightmare Theatre. Arthur Pembroke here. It might sound crazy, but I've always wanted to visit Alaska. Something about a massive, wide-open and sparsely populated region intrigues me. The open wilderness and the cold wind on my face. There is something mysterious about Alaska. So few people live there, yet so many disappearances take place. Tonight's story will focus on that aspect. It is an original tale and I do hope you enjoy it. Stay away from the Blackout Zone. Ryan Parker was always chasing the next thrill. His social media followers loved it. After climbing the most dangerous peaks and diving the deepest caves, he was hungry for more. This time, he had his sights set on an isolated corner of Alaska, off the grid, and way beyond the usual tourist traps. No roads, no maps, just wilderness as far as the eye could see. The goal was to investigate the multiple disappearances which had taken place here over the years. After weeks of planning, Ryan found a local guide, an older man named Abel Holloway, who was known for taking clients on risky, off-the-books expeditions. Abel wasn't eager at first, but Ryan's cash loosened his reluctance. They set off in a rusty, beat-up truck, bouncing down frozen trails until the roads disappeared. The landscape turned into a bleak wasteland of snow and ice. They made camp near the ruins of an abandoned research facility, just concrete slabs and steel skeletons barely visible in the swirling snow. Abel said it had been shut down in the 80s. No one ever said why. The first 2 days were uneventful. Ryan captured breathtaking drone footage of the frozen expanse and posted teasers online, but something felt wrong. At night, the wind was louder than it should have been. It wasn't just the usual moaning gusts. This sounded different, like whispers carried on the wind, too faint to make out but insistent. By the third night, the temperature plummeted, the sky bruised dark and stormy, and the wind rose to a deafening howl. Ryan and Abel sat in their tent, waiting out the storm. Abel had been unusually quiet, his gruff demeanor replaced with something else. Anxiety, maybe even fear. Then Ryan's satellite phone buzzed, an emergency alert. A sudden solar storm was causing a blackout in the region. No GPS, no communications, no tracking. They were completely off the grid now. Abel just nodded grimly as if expecting this. "What's going on?" Ryan asked. "You hear it, don't you?" Abel muttered, barely audible over the wind. "Hear what?" Abel stared at the canvas walls of the tent, as though something just beyond them was watching. "We shouldn't have come here, not during the blackout." Ryan frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The Blackout Zone," Abel whispered. "It only comes when the sun disappears behind the storm. There's something out there in the dark waiting for the right moment. It hunts during the blackout." Ryan scoffed. "You're messing with me." But Abel didn't laugh. He just stared at the tent flap, his breathing shallow. Outside, the wind picked up again, but this time it was different. Beneath the howling, there was a voice. It was faint at first, but slowly grew clearer. It seemed to be calling a name. It was calling Ryan's name. "Ryan!" The wind seemed to moan. "Ryan!" Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He shot Abel a look, but the old man was already pale, his face twisted in terror. "Ryan?" Suddenly Abel's face contorted. His eyes seemed to go completely black and sunk into his skull, almost like empty pits. A large, toothy grin seemed to spread across Abel's face, and he bolted from the tent, running on all fours like a wild animal into the storm. Ryan shouted after him, but Abel didn't stop. The voice in the wind grew louder. Ryan grabbed his gear and raced after Abel. The man was fast, unnaturally so. His footprints and handprints stretched farther apart, like something was pushing him forward. "Abel!" Ryan yelled, but the wind drowned him out. Then above the storm, Abel's voice rang out, "It must eat! It must eat!" Ryan stopped cold, fear creeping into his bones. He shined the flashlight ahead, but all he could see were long, stretched-out prints vanishing into the snow. The prints came to an abrupt end in the middle of the open field. Abel was gone. There was no trace of him, no sound, just the wind. And that voice, louder now, almost mocking. "Ryan!" Shaken to his core, Ryan stumbled back to their camp. The wind seemed to be stalking him, the voice trailing behind, growing more insistent with every step. The cold gnawed at his bones, but nothing could prepare him for what he found when he returned to the tent. It was torn apart. The canvas was shredded, flapping wildly in the wind. Gear was scattered everywhere, ripped open as though some wild animal, or something worse, had gone on a rampage. His sleeping bag lay in tatters, covered in a strange, oily, black substance that made Ryan gag. But there were no tracks. Nothing that could explain what had happened. The tent hadn't been attacked from the outside. It looked as if something had burst out from within. The wind howled again, and the voice cut through it like a knife. "Ryan!" Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He grabbed what little gear he could salvage and frantically scanned the horizon. There was only one place to go. The abandoned research facility. Whatever had happened to Abel, whatever was hunting them, he knew he couldn't stay out in the open. With the wind swirling around him like a living thing, Ryan made his way toward the distant ruins, hoping they might offer some kind of shelter. The research facility. The facility was more imposing up close. Hulking metal frames and crumbling concrete, jagged edges sticking up out of the snow like skeletal remains. As Ryan approached, the silence was deafening. The wind died abruptly as he stepped into the shadow of the ruins, as if even the storm was afraid to follow him here. The front door, rusted and frozen, hung slightly ajar. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, but at least the wind and that cursed voice were gone. Ryan's flashlight beam cut through the thick dust in the air, revealing long-abandoned workstations, broken equipment and endless corridors leading deeper into the facility. He ventured further inside, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. His breath hung in the air like a cloud as he passed faded warning signs and locked doors. But it was what he found in one of the back rooms that made his blood run cold. The room was filled with overturned chairs, scattered papers and broken lab equipment, but it was the walls that grabbed his attention. They were covered in frantic writing, carved into the concrete with something sharp. Words repeated over and over in jagged, erratic strokes. "They listen in the wind. Don't let it call you. The blackout brings them." In the corner, there was an old radio, long dead, its wires torn out. Nearby, a diary lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. Ryan picked it up, thumbing through until he found the last entry, written in a shaking hand. "The experiments failed. We couldn't control it. During the blackout, the creatures came. We thought it was just superstition until we heard the voices. Abel tried to warn us. Now he's one of them. The wind, it's alive. It needs to feed." Ryan's stomach churned. He dropped the diary, backing away from the room, his mind racing. Abel had known all along. But it was more than just a man. Something far older, something elemental. The Blackout Zone wasn't just a remote area. It was a place where the boundaries between our world and something else blurred. He had to get out, now! But as Ryan turned to leave, he heard it again. The wind, the voice, except this time it wasn't outside. It was here, inside the facility. "Ryan?" The temperature in the room plummeted, and Ryan's breath came in panicked gasps. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room, moving unnaturally, slithering along the walls. Something was here with him. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment he saw it, an oily black shape writhing along the ceiling, its tendrils of shadow reaching down like fingers. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, blinked open all at once, glowing faintly in the darkness. And the voice came again, now impossibly close. Ryan! Ryan bolted, running down the halls, the facility twisting into a labyrinth around him. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in, the darkness crawling after him. He sprinted through the snow-covered corridors, stumbling, falling, but always getting back up. The voice never stopped, never gave him a moment's peace. Finally, he reached the front doors and threw himself outside into the storm. But the wind was alive again. It screamed, the voice growing louder and louder until it was deafening. Ryan stopped, panting, staring up into the swirling storm, and there, high above him in the clouds, he saw it. A shape, massive, writhing, black as night, spanning the sky. Its tendrils stretched out like limbs, and countless eyes blinked open in the storm, all fixed on him. And then it descended, rushing toward him with impossible speed. Ryan fell to the ground, bracing for impact, but then, as suddenly as it came, the wind stopped. Silence smothered the air. Ryan looked up, his chest heaving in disbelief. Someone was standing there, silhouetted against the snow. It was Abel, but he was different. His face was pale, drawn tight, his eyes hollowed out, his skin rippled unnaturally like it didn't quite fit. And then he smiled, a cold, empty grin. "You shouldn't have come here, Ryan," Abel whispered, his voice strange and distorted, like it didn't belong to him anymore. "It needs to eat." Ryan stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What? What happened to you?" Abel's grin widened, revealing teeth too sharp, too yellow. "The entity needs a sacrifice. I made a deal. Someone has to feed it, to keep it satisfied. And now, Ryan, it's your turn." Ryan tried to run, but Abel's form shifted, his limbs elongating unnaturally, the darkness clinging to him as though he were a part of it now. Tendrils of shadow shot out, wrapping around Ryan's ankles, dragging him back into the icy, waiting maw of the facility. The last thing Ryan heard was his own name, screamed by 1,000 voices on the wind, as the darkness swallowed him whole. As the doors slammed shut behind them, the wind outside picked up once again, howling with renewed vigor. In the following weeks, no trace of Ryan Parker was ever found. His last post, teasing his Alaskan adventure, went viral after his disappearance. But those who live near the area avoid it to this day, especially during solar storms. They say that when the winds howl just right, you can still hear the voices calling for those foolish enough to wander into the Blackout Zone. And that is the end of tonight's story. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you all again tomorrow night.